Clarissa Dean stood at the center of the grand rooftop ballroom, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor as she moved between guests in elegant dresses and expensive suits, her diamond necklace glinting like a quiet reminder of the fortune she controlled. As the CEO of one of the most powerful tech firms in America, Clarissa had it all: youth, beauty, brilliance, and billions, but what she didn't have was humility, or love, or even true friendship. She was feared, admired, envied, but never really known, and she preferred it that way. On this night, she hosted another of her famous high society gatherings, where champagne flowed like rivers and people came more to be seen than to connect. The room buzzed with conversations about markets, mergers, and money, and Clarissa, in her sleek silver dress, raised a glass and announced with an amused smirk, "I have a new challenge tonight for entertainment." Of course, the room quieted, attention turning toward her. "Beat me in chess," she said, waving toward a crystal board that shimmered under the soft chandelier lights, "and I'll marry you." Some laughed, others clapped, but no one stepped forward. Her eyes scanned the room, daring the proud men in their $1,000 tuxedos, but not one of them moved. They knew she was a national chess champion in college, a strategist who could destroy even skilled opponents in a few moves. It was a joke, of course, one of her power games. Another way to remind everyone she was untouchable till a quiet voice rose from the back of the room, gentle yet firm, saying, "I accept." Heads turned, eyebrows raised, and gasps broke the silence as they saw who had spoken. A tall, middle-aged black man in a worn gray uniform, holding a mop and bucket, stepped forward slowly. Marvin, the janitor. He had worked there for years, always quiet, always respectful, often invisible to the people who passed him in the halls, like he was part of the wall. But tonight, something in his calm voice made even Clarissa pause. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "You accept?" she asked, as if unsure she'd heard him right. Marvin nodded, setting his mop aside. "I do," he said, not with arrogance, but with certainty. People began to whisper, snicker, record on their phones. "This is ridiculous," one man muttered, and another chuckled. "He doesn't know what he's doing." But Clarissa, amused and intrigued, motioned toward the board. "Bring him a chair," she said, her tone laced with playful cruelty. "Let's not say I'm unfair." Marvin sat down quietly, his long fingers brushing the edge of the chessboard, eyes scanning the pieces like he already saw the ending. Clarissa made the first move, quick and confident, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips as the crowd leaned in, eager to see the humiliation. Marvin responded with a slow, thoughtful movement. The second move came. Clarissa began to frown. The third move was hers. Again, but something in Marvin's pattern made her hesitate. She moved anyway. Then Marvin leaned forward, slid a piece, and said softly, "Checkmate." For a moment, silence swallowed the room. No one breathed. Clarissa's fingers froze above the board. She blinked at the pieces, then looked again. It was true. He had beaten her in just 3 moves. The entire room gasped, phones recording her stunned face. Laughter dying midair, shock spreading like a quiet explosion. Clarissa sat back slowly, her mouth slightly open, as if trying to piece together what just happened. Marvin stood up, nodded respectfully, and turned to walk away, retrieving his mop without another word. "Wait," she called out, her voice barely audible over the stunned murmurs. He stopped, turning halfway. "Who are you?" she asked, not with anger, but with something she rarely showed in certainty. Marvin looked at her, and for the first time, there was no fear, no submission in his eyes. "Just a man who used to dream bigger," he said quietly. Then he turned and walked back toward the elevator, his figure slowly swallowed by the shadows of the hallway, leaving behind a room full of people who had just seen something they'd never forget. A woman who, for the first time in years, had no idea what to say next. Marvin walked out of the ballroom without looking back, his mop and bucket rolling behind him as confused murmurs filled the space he left behind. While Clarissa sat frozen, her perfectly planned world shaken by a man no one had ever noticed before tonight. The moment he disappeared into the shadows of the service hallway, people rushed around her with questions, laughter, and theories, but she heard none of them. Her eyes were still locked on the chessboard, unable to understand how a janitor had seen what she hadn't. She had been confident over confident, and, in just 3 moves, he had exposed her weakness. As the party ended and the guests left with stories to tell, Clarissa remained seated, sipping cold champagne, replaying every move in her mind like a puzzle that refused to make sense. The next morning, she arrived early at her office, but instead of going to meetings or checking stock reports, she pulled up the security footage from the night before, slowing it down, watching Marvin's hands move with care and confidence. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only quiet focus, like someone who had done this 1,000 times before. She narrowed her eyes, then opened the employee files, and searched his name. Marvin Ellison. What she found surprised. Her age 45. No college degree listed. Worked at the company for 7 years as a maintenance worker. Quiet, punctual, no complaints, no awards, nothing special on record, but something about him gnawed at her curiosity, and she couldn't let it go. She called the head of facilities and asked to see Marvin again, but he wasn't on duty. The next day passed, and the next, but still no sign of him. She finally left her glass office and went down to the basement level herself, where the fluorescent lights flickered and the air smelled faintly of bleach. She found Marvin sitting alone in the break room, reading an old paperback novel, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, like he had no idea he had become the talk of the entire company. When she stepped in, he looked up, calm as ever, and gave a polite nod. "Miss Dean," he said. "Or should I say, future wife," she said with a smirk, trying to break the tension, but her voice lacked its usual bite. Marvin only smiled softly and set the book down. "You didn't expect to lose," he said. "Not as an insult, but a fact." "I didn't expect you to even know how to play," she replied. They stared at each other for a long moment, the silence between them thick with curiosity. "Who taught you?" she asked finally. Marvin leaned back and stared at the ceiling for a second before answering. "My father. He was a janitor too, but he loved chess. Said the game taught you more about people than school ever could." Clarissa studied his face, trying to read the quiet depth behind his words. "You said you used to dream bigger," she said. "What happened?" Marvin took a slow breath and gave a tired smile. "Life happened. Death happened. And dreams, well, they're fragile when no one helps hold them up." There was something in his tone that made her chest tighten. A human sadness that didn't belong to the corporate world she lived in. "You're not just a janitor," she said. "No more than you're just a CEO," he replied. That line struck her harder than she expected. For a second, she didn't feel powerful or rich or beautiful, just seen, like someone had finally looked past her armor. She straightened up and asked, "Would you play again?" Marvin raised an eyebrow. "Do you want to lose again?" "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe I just want to learn how you did it." They played another game right there, on a cheap plastic board someone had left in the break room. This time, she lasted longer, 6 moves, but still lost. But this time, she laughed. It had been years since she'd laughed like that, not out of politeness or image, but because she was actually enjoying herself. Over the next few days, they played more games. In the mornings, before her meetings, she'd stop by the break room. In the evenings, she'd sit with him while the rest of the office emptied. Each time she learned something, not just about chess, but about Marvin. He had once been a rising star in the local chess circuit, even trained under a grandmaster, for a short while. But when his wife died suddenly in a car crash, everything fell apart. He lost motivation, quit the game, and took the first job he could find to pay the bills. The board stopped making sense after she left. He told her once, "I couldn't see the future moves anymore." Clarissa listened quietly, realizing how little she actually knew about people who worked around her. For the first time, she began noticing the janitors, the security guards, the cafeteria workers, people she used to walk past without a glance. Marvin had changed something in her, and she didn't know what to do with it. One night, after a particularly close game, she asked him, "Why did you really challenge me that night?" Marvin looked at her and said, "Because I saw a person hiding behind power, and I wanted to remind her that someone still sees her." That line stayed with her long after she went home. In her glass penthouse, surrounded by silence, she thought of how different her life had become in just a few days, not because of money or deals or promotions, but because someone had dared to challenge her, not with anger, but with intelligence and grace. And she realized that Marvin hadn't humiliated her, he had awakened her. The next morning, she walked into the board meeting late, her mind still full of chess pieces and quiet wisdom. And the board members stared as she smiled for no reason at all. They didn't understand what had happened, but she did. She had lost a game in 3 moves, but gained something far greater, the beginning of change. As days turned into quiet evenings, and Clarissa found herself returning again and again to that dim break room, where a chessboard now seemed more valuable than a corner office, she began to realize that Marvin wasn't just a man who had mastered Chessie was a man who had mastered silence, and there was a reason he spoke so little about his past. Every move he made across the board seemed to carry a history she couldn't yet see, like the echoes of a life once lived boldly, now buried beneath cleaning rags and gray uniforms. Clarissa tried asking more questions, casual ones, at first, about his childhood, family, old friends, but Marvin would always smile softly and shift the topic, deflecting with stories that said little, even though his eyes always said much more. She felt like she was standing outside a locked door, one that she couldn't open no matter how many games they played, or how often she showed up with coffee or conversation. And then, one rainy evening, she found herself in the building long after most employees had gone home. She had forgotten her laptop charger, and instead of sending an assistant, she drove back alone. But as she entered through the service hallways, something she never used before she met Marvin, she heard faint music coming from a side room she didn't even know existed. Curious, she followed the sound down a narrow hallway with flickering lights until she reached an old supply closet with a broken sign on the door. It wasn't locked. She pushed it open slowly and stepped into a small, dimly lit room. What she saw froze her. The walls were covered with old newspaper clippings, tournament flyers, faded photographs, and hand-drawn chess puzzles. A dusty glass shelf held several trophies: first place, runner-up, state champion. There was a picture of a much younger Marvin shaking hands with a famous chess master at a New York event, both smiling proudly. In the corner sat a wooden chessboard, worn at the edges, the pieces neatly arranged for a game that never started. And on the desk lay a folded letter, addressed to Cynthia. Clarissa didn't touch anything. She just stood there, realizing that this wasn't a storage room, it was a hidden shrine to a life Marvin had once lived. The quiet man with the mop had once been a champion, a name on posters, a rising figure in a game that demanded brilliance. She stepped back quietly, heart pounding, and left the room as silently as she had entered, suddenly feeling like an intruder in someone else's heartbreak. The next morning, she waited for Marvin at his usual spot. He arrived, as always, calm and early, but she could see a slight change in his eyes when he noticed her waiting with tension. "You found the room," he said before she could even speak. She nodded. "Why hide it?" she asked gently. Marvin sighed and leaned against the wall. "Because it hurts," he said. "That room is a reminder of everything I lost." Clarissa didn't speak. She just listened. Marvin continued slowly, his voice steady but low, like someone reading from a memory he had kept buried for years. He told her about his youth, growing up in a rough neighborhood where chess was his escape, how he rose quickly through local ranks, caught the attention of coaches, and won state tournaments that should have changed his life. He told her about Cynthia, his wife, his best friend, who supported his dreams even when they had no money, who believed in him more than he believed in himself. He told her how she used to sit beside him at every game, whispering reminders not to let the crowd get to him. And then, one day, while driving to his most important tournament, Cynthia was hit by a drunk driver. She died on impact. Marvin never made it to the game. And after that, he never played publicly again. He sold everything, left the world of chess, and took a job where no one would ask him about his past. Chess stopped being a game, he said. It became a ghost. Clarissa felt her throat tighten. She had judged Marvin based on his uniform, his silence, his floor mopped. He had lived a life more meaningful, more painful, and more beautiful than anyone in her circle of billionaires could imagine. She realized that his three-move checkmate wasn't just strategy, it was memory, instinct, and sorrow wrapped into something powerful. She looked at him and said, "You should still be playing." Marvin shook his head. "That part of me is over." But Clarissa wasn't convinced. She left that day feeling like a fire had started in her chest, something she couldn't put out. That night, she opened her laptop and started researching old chess archives. She found records of Marvin's games under the name M.E. Ellison, videos of him as a young man beating top players with quiet confidence. She even found a short documentary that had once featured him as the silent genius of Harlem. The world had forgotten him, but Clarissa hadn't. The next morning, she printed out one of his old championship photos, framed it, and left it in the break room with a sticky note. "The world should have known you. I still want to." Marvin didn't say anything when he saw it, but his hand shook slightly when he picked it up. That afternoon, she found him in the supply room again, playing a solo game against himself on the old wooden board. He looked up and said, "You know, there's a tournament next week. For charity. No prize money. Just heart." She smiled. "Then let's go." For the first time, Marvin didn't say no. And in that moment, Clarissa knew the door wasn't locked anymore. He had just needed someone to knock the right way. The community chess tournament was held in an old church gym that smelled of dusty wood and memories. Nothing like the marble floors and luxury views Clarissa Dean was used to. But as she walked in beside Marvin, holding a coffee in one hand and his registration paper in the other, she felt oddly at peace, like she was exactly where she needed to be. Gone was the cold CEO who once towered above others with her voice and wealth. Now she was just a woman walking beside a man who once mopped her floors, yet somehow taught her more about life than all her Ivy League professors and board meetings combined. Marvin said little as they entered, nodding to a few older men who recognized him immediately and raised their eyebrows in disbelief, whispering among themselves like ghosts, seeing one of their own come back to life. Clarissa watched it all unfold quietly, amazed by the respect he earned without asking for it. The matches began, rows of plastic tables and folding chairs, timers clicking like little hearts beating across the room, and Marvin played with calm hands and sharp eyes, one game after another, beating opponents with the same silent grace that had stunned her that night on the rooftop. People began to gather around him, kids, elders, even competitors who had lost to him, and still smiled, grateful just to have played against someone who made the game feel poetic. Clarissa stood off to the side, her designer coat folded over her arm, completely unaware that the news of her presence was already spreading online. Tech CEO spotted at local tournament, they said, photos snapping her beside a janitor. Though they didn't know who he really was. She didn't care. She wasn't there for press. She was there because something in her was changing. Something deep and unspoken, like the old pieces of herself were being replaced with new ones, stronger, simpler, more human. That evening, after Marvin won the finals with a brilliant endgame move that made the entire room clap in awe, he and Clarissa walked back to her car under a street lamp that flickered in the gentle breeze. And for the first time, she looked at him, not with curiosity or admiration, but with something else, gratitude. "You didn't just beat me at chess," she said, unlocking the door. "You woke me up." Marvin didn't reply right away, just watched the wind play with her hair, before he finally said, "You were never asleep. You were just surrounded by noise." The next few weeks passed like a quiet symphony. Clarissa made changes in her ones. She installed reading spaces in the break rooms, created free evening classes for employees who wanted to learn chess or financial planning, or even cooking. She stopped having separate elevators for executives and staff. She asked janitors to sit in on team brainstorms just to hear different kinds of thinking. Her board of directors didn't understand it, but her employees did. Productivity went up, but more than that, something warmer began to grow across the floors of her company, a sense that people mattered again. Meanwhile, she and Marvin continued to meet, sometimes playing chess, sometimes walking through the park, sometimes just sitting in silence. She would share stories from her childhood, how she lost her mother young and threw herself into business to avoid feeling anything. Marvin would listen without judgment, only sometimes offering a line that felt like a puzzle piece falling into place. Slowly, she realized she didn't need to impress him. He had already seen her fully, completely, without makeup or masks. One morning, as they sat in the cafe across from the chess academy he had started volunteering at, Clarissa looked around and saw kids from all backgrounds sitting together, learning to play from volunteers who once had no one to guide them, and she felt a lump rise in her throat. "You could have had all of this years ago," she said. Marvin smiled gently. "Maybe, but then I wouldn't have met you at the right time." She stared at him, wondering if there was something deeper in his words. But before she could ask, his phone buzzed and he excused himself with a soft nod. That night, Clarissa stood in front of her mirror, staring at her reflection in the silence of her penthouse. And for the first time in her adult life, she didn't see a powerful CEO or a woman in control. She saw someone learning to be whole. Her phone lit up with texts from old friends, tabloids, and even her ex-fiancé, who had once left her because she was too cold to love, all trying to reach her now that she had become the face of a different kind of leadership. She ignored them. Instead, she opened her laptop and began writing something new: a plan to fund chess programs in inner-city schools, to create partnerships with libraries and community centers, and to honor forgotten talent. At the top of the proposal, she typed one line, inspired by a man who never needed a title to lead. The next day, Marvin didn't show up to their usual meeting spot, nor the day after. Clarissa waited, worry growing in her chest, and finally called the facilities department, who told her Marvin had taken medical leave. Her heart sank. She drove to the small apartment complex he lived in, a place she had never been, and knocked. On his door, no answer. A neighbor told her he had gone to the hospital 2 nights ago. Chest pains. Something about a heart condition he'd never told anyone about. Clarissa rushed there, fear tightening every step she took. When she found him, lying in a quiet hospital room, with machines blinking softly beside him, he looked up and smiled, as if he had been expecting her all along. "You didn't tell me," she said, tears already threatening. "Didn't want to worry you," he whispered. "You've already changed enough." She sat beside him and held his hand, realizing that the woman who had once feared vulnerability was now sitting in the most vulnerable moment of her life. In that quiet room, full of beeping monitors and unseen memories, Clarissa didn't feel like a CEO or a leader or a woman with power. She felt like someone in love, not just with a man, but with what he had brought out of her. And in that moment, she knew she didn't marry a man. She had found herself. The wedding was just days away. But something didn't feel right to Madison, the powerful CEO who once made headlines with her arrogant challenge. "Beat me at chess, and I'll marry you." No one expected Jamal, the soft-spoken black janitor, with quiet eyes and calloused hands, to defeat her in 3 swift moves, changing both their lives forever. But the world didn't know what came after that checkmate. Madison had learned more about herself in these few months than in all her years building empires and crushing boardrooms. And now, standing in front of the mirror in her $1,000 wedding dress, she wasn't thinking about the ceremony or the headlines. It was Jamal's mother's old Bible on the desk that kept pulling her attention. With a folded photo tucked inside it, Jamal as a child, playing chess with older men at a rundown community center, eyes full of hunger, not just to win, but to belong. That morning, Madison walked barefoot through the hallway of her penthouse, memories crashing in like waves. Jamal, teaching young boys in the park. His quiet kindness with the cleaning staff. His laughter when no one was watching. He had revealed bits of himself slowly, with trust earned piece by piece, like pawns on a board. And yet Madison knew, despite everything, there was one final move she had to make alone. At the wedding rehearsal, when the room was filled with press, flowers, and polite fake smiles, Madison stepped forward, took the mic, and paused. Looking directly at Jamal, her voice calm but strong. "I can't marry you. Not yet." Gasps filled the room. But Jamal didn't look hurt, he looked curious. "I love you," she continued, "but I spent my whole life building walls, chasing power, and calling it strength. And you broke through that with grace, not force. But I need to know who I am without the armor. I need to step away and find the real me. Not the CEO, not the bride, just ... Madison." The silence was heavy, but then Jamal stood, walked up to her, and took her hand gently. "Then go," he said softly. "Not because I want to lose you, but because I want all of you, the real you. Not a woman pretending she's ready." That night, Madison left behind the empire, the headlines, even her last name. She traveled small towns, quiet places, teaching chess to girls in shelters, working with women who had lost their voices. Each day, she peeled back the layers of who she was taught to be, and started discovering who she truly was. It wasn't about crowns or kings, it was about peace, purpose, and presence. Months passed. Jamal kept teaching to never chasing, never pressuring. They wrote letters, sometimes funny, sometimes sad, always honest. And then, one quiet autumn morning, Madison returned, not in a limo, not with cameras, just herself, with a backpack and a chessboard in her hand. Jamal was teaching under the old oak tree, where it had all started. She sat across from him, placed the board between them, and smiled. "You'll move," she said. He smiled back, the corners of his eyes crinkling with joy. "No," he whispered. "It's yours. It's always been yours." And that was her final move, not to win, but to love, fully and freely. The queen had finally learned that true power wasn't in domination, but in surrender. And in that moment, without a ring or a crowd, they belonged to each other, equal, open, and unafraid.